Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Through the Bible studies, in which we'll be summarizing the book of Esther. Now, once again, I need to emphasize to those of you listening, this is not intended to be a substitute for personal Bible study, but rather an opportunity for you to know the background and overview of the book to assist you in personal Bible study. So, understanding what the book of Esther is, it is the conclusion to the historical section of the Old Testament. We'll be moving into poetry after this. Chronologically, it would bring us to the end of the Old Testament and noting that 400-year gap of time between the prophet Malachi and the book of Matthew. But also understand as well, the book of Esther, as written by Mordecai, the one who bore witness to all of these things, taking place in the 5th century BC. Specifically, if you want the day and the month, it would be the 13th through the 15th days of Adar, which is the Hebrew month that would fall around mid-March in our calendar. Takes place geographically in Persia, but also gives us the historical background of the festival of Purim. And Purim is the plural form of lots. It was like a string of good luck. But what was also interesting about this is that while this book doesn't mention God's name once, we see his handiwork throughout all of it. And that's why the intended takeaway for the book of Esther is that God always keeps his promises. And we see one example historically of the countless that are given to us, not only in Scripture, but that we continue to see affirmed to our lives today. So starting with the book of Esther and the festival of Purim, its origins are obviously with the problem that brought Esther into the kingdom in the first place. Because understand, Esther wasn't Persian royalty. She was married into it. And before she was married into it, there was some really weird circumstances that surrounded her introduction to Persian royalty. Let's just say that. The king Ahasuerus, or Artaxerxes as he's known, divorces his wife. I believe her name was Vashti. Vashti was her name. And marries Esther. And the circumstances surrounding this were hardly high class. You see, the king was at the peak of his power, and probably at a very high point in the overall Persian influence as well. The kingdom spanned all the way from the Euphrates River to the Nile River, and they had a very, very high amount of resources in what was known as the Fertile Crescent. You see, after Babylon was taken over by the Persians, he's essentially achieved the brunt of the work of those who were fighting and saving before him. And so while the Jews were living in Babylon at this time, they hadn't yet fully returned back to the land, but the construction process had started. Esther and Mordecai, the two main characters in all this, were living in Babylon while the Jewish people were also there with them, the majority of them. Now, the king wanted to show off how well off his kingdom was. So he gathered all of his governors, all of his foreign ambassadors, all the people who were in alliances with him, all of his friends, all of his family. He just opened it up to the public, basically. And he said, hey, anyone who wants anything they want to eat, we got it. Costco doesn't have anything on our kitchen. We have anything that you want. You can eat as much as you want, and especially you can drink as much as you want. And while this kind of debacle was going on for multiple weeks, they were just feasting and enjoying and having a good time, and this just became the standard quo for the king at this time in his life. Now, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he was also known, was getting a little sauced, and while he was aware when you have that much alcohol at your disposal, it's not a good idea to have mixed company. So his queen, his favorite wife, Vashti, he had other wives as well, but this was his most beautiful, his favorite wife. She was handling the banquet for the women, because while they're getting sauced and they're getting sauced, it's better they're just keeping the sauces separate in the condiment section, if you know what I mean. So they're both just basically enjoying the abundance of their kingdom's provisions, and the king decides while he's under the influence that he has a great idea. Why don't, if I've been showing off how great my kingdom is, why don't I show you all how hot my wife is, basically. And so he said, why don't you go and call Vashti? The king gave an order, and remember, the king's not used to being told no. Why don't you go tell my wife Vashti to come in here, take off her veil, and show her beauty off to the rest of my bros, my guys. Well, understand that firstly, Vashti had a little bit more self-respect than she was being given credit for. She said no. And the reason why it was unreasonable, if not downright scumbaggy, for the king to ask her to do this sort of thing. I mean, we just think like today, oh, a face scarf. Why would it be so wrong as to take that off? Well, understand, she wasn't forced to wear this hijab-style garment. In Persia, in Persian culture, to veil yourself, to wear those kinds of coverings whenever you go into a public setting, was their definition of modesty. It wasn't until Islam that this was to be made the status quo by force. And while this mark of modesty meant a lot to them, understand, it was basically her saying, look, my beauty is something that I've committed my life, my love to my husband. And even though he has all these different wives, I have enough integrity and character to say, you know what, regardless of how he's treating other people, I'm going to value my relationship with him and myself to dress modestly, as her culture defined it. So basically, it would be the modern equivalent today of, hey, honey, take off your veil, show the guys how pretty you are. We just think like just showing your face. We're used to that in this culture. In fact, there's probably more modesty now than ever before. But understand as well, it would be basically in our terms, saying, okay, guys are sitting down watching the Super Bowl in America. You know, we're cheering on whichever team is less hated on Facebook, whatever. The commercials are getting kind of boring, so the husband yells out and says, hey, honey, you guys want to see how hot my wife is? Why don't you put on that skimpy bikini, or maybe less? Come into the room and show off to the guys. Do a little dance for us and stuff. That may seem crass, but again, that's why Vashti is just like, no. Even to the king, even if it meant almost her life would be at stake at this point, she said, no. I respect myself more than you're giving me credit for. I'm not doing that. And so the king, he got upset and he said, well, if you won't obey me, then you're fired. But understand, this had more than just his own sauced out influences at work here, because the other guys were as insecure in their masculinity as could be. They said, well, let's just think about this practically for a second, because that's the only time they were thinking practically, is how can I control my wife? What if Vashti won't, if the queen won't tell the king of Persia, won't do what the king of Persia tells her to do, then what's going to happen when I go home and I ask my wife to do something for me? It would basically be like the modern, or not the modern, but like an actual legitimate feminist movement. It's like, look, no, we're not going to do that. We have some actual ability to decide for ourselves what we do with our bodies, thank you very much. And this was an actual issue that was being put forward. So the king's advisors were just like, uh-oh, I don't want the practical consequences of this. I want to remain in charge and not actually have to prove any character on my end for it. You may want to make a statement here, King. So he's still hammered, and he's just like, Vashti, you are no longer the official queen of Persia. You're just going to be someone in my harem. You're fired from your political position. And then kind of put salt in the wound to anyone who would even think of questioning the king's authority, and by extension question the man's authority in the household, not because he's a good man, but because he said so. He sent out a letter throughout all the empire and said, any beautiful woman who wants to be made the official queen of Persia, sign up for this beauty contest. You'll have a full year of spa treatments, courtesy of the government, to get ready for it. And even if you don't win the contest and become queen, you'll be made a part of the king's harem if you're a runner-up, and essentially just be given free meals, tax exemption, living on easy street for the rest of your life. And so, naturally, there were a lot of people who volunteered. But there were also those in the empire, like Vashti, who are like, yeah, so basically what you're saying is I become a object to gratify the king whenever he gets frisky, and you'll just pay for me to live in his house forever. thanks, but no thanks. I value myself a little bit too much for that. Nonetheless, there were some who volunteered willingly. It's just like, all I have to do is sleep with a king every now and then. Sure, I'll accept your tax exemption and free meals for the rest of my life. There were others who were told you have volunteered because the guards looked at her and they said, yeah, the king's going to like you. Well, that's when Esther comes into the scene. Because while there was a distance as far as things were concerned historically between when Vashti was fired as queen and when this contest came out, the king had his little excursion into Greece, tried to conquer it, saw some victories, but ultimately failed. So with his tail between his legs, licking his wounds, and if you're wondering, that's what the movies about the 300 are based on. He comes back, he's depressed that he didn't get a total victory in conquering Greece, and so basically the king's advisors are like, uh-oh, he's getting lonely, we better do something about this, he might regret what he did with Vashti. So they find a suitable replacement. Well, Esther, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah, was an orphan. And she was raised actually by her cousin Mordecai. Very sad upbringing and very sad circumstances. She was a beautiful woman and chosen against her will for this contest. She valued herself enough not to say, no, I'm not an object for any guy, let alone the guy who was in charge of the world at this time. But the guards nonetheless said, hey, you're coming with us. So she went. She didn't want to make a scene of it, but understand as well, this wasn't all that bad. Granted, she would be married to this kind of scumbag, but she would also be very much taken care of, given free spa treatments for an entire year. That was going to be her life from this point going forward. And also, would you have it, for some reason, the king chose her as the most beautiful person in all the Persian Empire. Obviously, there's something going on here. Esther's being set up to do something amazing. She's made the Queen of Persia, and that is now her official title. Now, it was also during this time, Mordecai still taking care of her, still a part of her life. Her cousin, her older cousin, basically raised her, and so he's still keeping in contact. She goes to Babylon, he's going to Babylon too. And while they were there, Mordecai overhears that two of the king's doorkeepers are planning on setting up an assassination attempt on the king. And Mordecai, knowing God's law, knowing God's word, he's saying, look, we're under this king's authority. All authority comes from God. We're not supporting this, even if we don't support the king. So he goes and he tells the king, hey, these two doorkeepers are planning to kill you. And so they find the doorkeepers, they interrogate them, they confess to the plot, and they're executed. And it was at this point that Mordecai gets a really positive standing in the king's eyes. Like, this guy saved my life. He may have plenty of other people in his court that have very high regard, but Mordecai is now one of them. Now, there's another man in Mordecai's court while this was happening. Esther's now queen. Mordecai's now of influence in the king's court. Not prominently, but he's there. There was also the king's best friend, very high in position as far as his influence in the king's court. And this man's name was Haman. And Haman was an Agagite, or an Agagite. He was related to the Amalekite king Agag. That's where the term comes from. And for those of you who've been with us in our Old Testament summaries know that Israel has had some very positive interactions with the Amalekites as of ever. We'll recap those here in a minute, but let's just focus on where we're at right now. Haman was in very good with the king, and so he says, hey, what do you think if we were to have like a parade for you that I would host, of course, and we'd have everyone bow down and worship you as a god? He's like, yeah, I like that. So Haman's basically set up this giant float representing the king, and he's saying, bow down and worship your god, because I represent the king, right? So you all bow down, worship me as God. And everyone would do it. They're used to bowing down to anything and everything 6 days a week, twice on Sunday. But Mordecai, while in this land, he decided, I'm not going to attend those parties that day. I'll just walk home on a different street. And Haman was not the wiser. It wasn't as if Mordecai went all Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, defiantly standing up while everyone was bowing down, drawing attention to himself. No, he just said, I'm not going to attend that party that day. I'm just not going to be on those streets when Haman's having everyone bow down to him. And one of Haman's servants saw him, leaving. And he followed him and said, hey, why don't you bow down to Haman? And he says, I just don't want to. I'm Jewish. I'm sorry. And so he just goes on his way. Well, Haman, he's, basking in all this glory that he's presented for himself. And then he goes home, and one of his servants comes up to him and says, hey, there was this guy named Mordecai. He doesn't like attending your bow down to me and worship me as God parties. And Haman's like, why would he do that? Why wouldn't everyone want to bow down to me? And he said, well, he's Jewish. He doesn't bow down to anyone except his God. Well, Haman does a little math in his head. So Mordecai's Jewish, and Jews don't bow down to anyone but their God. I'm not their God. That means he doesn't want to bow down to me. So he mopes and he whines about it to his wife, and eventually he just gets the gears rolling in his head until finally, with the kind of thought process that only the Amalekite culture could conjure, Mordecai is a Jew, and Jews won't bow down to me. I'm going to murder everyone he's ever related to ever, so that there will be no one left alive on this earth who would dare even consider not bowing down to me. This man won't bow down to you and worship you as God. I'm going to murder every one of his race. And there any wonder why God told Saul that these people weren't to be negotiated with? Now understand this. The Amalekite stereotype, obviously, set by Haman, wasn't just the rare exception. It was the rule. Because understand, the first time the Amalekites ever interacted with the nation of Israel, we're going all the way back to the book of Numbers. When they were wandering in the wilderness, leaving Egypt, the Amalekites saw a large group of people, assumed they had some money with them, which they did, and decided, do we go and bring our resources and trade with them to acquire what we want, legally and through fair exchange, perhaps sharing the profit between us two nations? Or perhaps what we should do, would you twain to consider the mere junction of looking to where, the people would be less able to fight back against us should we pretense raid them? What if we were to be so intricate as to specifically target men, women, children, and cripples that couldn't defend themselves? The people who were specifically in the back of the camp, who couldn't keep up with the strong, with the soldiers, with the people, who were actually capable of fighting back should a band of pirates come along, and decided to just murder a couple hundred innocent people and make off with their stuff. Well, the battle progressed. Joshua led it. And of course, you remember the situation with Moses raising his hands up. But God made a statement, not only in the ears of all of the Amalekites, something that they were aware of, but also to the nation of Israel. He told Israel, when you are militarily strong, you are to wipe these people off the face of the earth. There is no negotiating with them. 400 years after that prophecy was the time of King Saul, the first king of Israel, and he had the military capability and the opportunity and the direct command of God. No, it wasn't just, I read in my history to wipe out the Amalekites. There's some Amalekites, why don't I just go and kill them now? No, God said, now is the time where they have exhausted every single last chance. How many years were they given with this warning to perhaps not do it anymore? 400! And they ignored it. And now that the consequences were coming, Saul was told to do one thing, obey God. He had disobeyed God twice up until this point, and this was strike 3. You were told to wipe out the Amalekites because if they're allowed to live in your land, you are essentially making an ISIS member your neighbor. These people are crazy. Their culture is founded upon raiding, pillaging, and killing anyone who they want something from. And we see that the legacy is continued with Haman, because when it finally comes to the Amalekites to be wiped out, what does Saul do? Does he obey God? No. He spares Agag, the king. What was Haman again? An Agagite. or an Agagite, or however you'd say it. He was related to the survivors that Saul spared, who were the family of this king, Agag. Samuel took it on himself to do what Saul wouldn't, but even though Agag was dead, his family continued on. And while all this was happening, they had kids, they rebuilt their nation, they preserved their culture, as unpleasant as it was, and by the time that they had been given 400 extra years, aware that they had brought that all on themselves, they still reject God's command. They still have this insane grudge against God's people, not because their culture was wiped out, but because they have something that they want. And that's for everyone to bow down to him. And how dare someone not give me what I want? And so Haman continues on his family legacy very well. And it's any wonder why God ordered these people wiped out after not 400 now, but 800 years of second chances. And if I'm doing my math right, it'd be more like 900 at this point. So understand that. The Amalekites aren't being judged by God for anything that they aren't aware that they should have stopped doing a long time ago. They were warned. And just like the Assyrians were given a chance and accepted mercy, the Amalekites, in Assyria, by the way, their capital is Nineveh. So if you're familiar with the book of Jonah, they were given a warning, 40 days. And you guys are going to be wiped out for the sins you've committed against the true and living God. They didn't know there was a true and living God or that their actions were offending him. So they came to him and asked him for mercy, and God said, "Thank you for the excuse." Now granted, the next generation knew better, started doing the things that they knew were wrong now, and they were held accountable for it. That will go into when we get to the book of Obadiah, I believe it was. But as far as where we're at right now, the Amalekites are still on the world scene. When God specifically commanded Saul to wipe them out, he disobeyed them. Now they're facing the consequences because just one of them is now about to wipe out the entire Jewish nation. How is he going to do that? Well, remember, he isn't good with the king. He has influence in the king's court, more so than Mordecai. And so he comes to him with the kind of confidence that only a fraud like him could conjure and say, "Hey, king, there's this group of people that they are real rebellious, okay? I mean, I can't really even get into specifics with you. It's just so many. They're rebels. They don't obey your laws. They're just real cruel and evil people. They can't be controlled or maintained. So what I propose here on my little PowerPoint here, what people group? Well, I can't get into specifics right now. But what you do is, why don't we have a little holiday where we offer a reward? If you kill anyone from this specific group, then, and you'll see it in the fine print, which I know you'll always read, then what you're going to do is pay them basically hundreds of thousands of dollars if they kill a Jewish family. And also on top of that, anyone who kills the family can keep their stuff too. So what do you think? And he's like, "Well, I've never doubted your judgment before, Haman. I'll sign it for you." Well, he didn't obviously read the fine print or know that that would also include his queen, his wife. It'd be very interesting when it fell through. So Mordecai hears that this law is being passed, and they're building this super special giant gallows where they'd hang people by a noose. And he'd say, like, carving Mordecai's name into it. It's like, "I'm going to get you, man." And Mordecai sheds quite a few manly tears when he finds out that the entire Jewish nation is going to be annihilated on their special international Kill the Jews Day. Well, this manipulation was to take place on the 13th day of Adar. Now you'd note the 14th and the 15th are the festival of Purim. All of these things are taking place, and Mordecai, obviously, not only concerned for his own safety, but his cousin's, for Esther. He writes her. And understand why they were writing each other. Once again, it'd look bad on the tabloid, so to speak, if it's less like one of the king's court representatives meets privately with his wife. Doesn't look, I mean, granted, Mordecai would never do anything, but understand that doesn't look good politically. So they're just writing each other. And he lets her know, and this is what he says. When he lets her know the Jews are all going to be wiped out, you got to put a stop to this. You're closer to him than I am. Esther's like, you don't understand the politics here, Mordecai. Understand, assassins are everywhere. And so what they've done to prevent those kinds of situations from happening is that if anyone comes into the king's presence uninvited, they've got 2 seconds before their head's chopped off. The only thing that would spare their life is the king sees them, recognizes them, and trusts them enough to spare them by raising his scepter. It's the little ball and the stick thing that you usually see associated with kings of England. That was their gesture of power. It would be his legal authority in saying, hey, I recognize they have a right to be here. They're not here to kill me. I trust them. So Esther's saying, look, if he's in a bad mood that day, my head's coming off. And this is what Mordecai's response was to her. Esther chapter 4, verses 13 through 14. Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Remember, they're pen pals, right? Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai's point is, look, Esther, if you just stay silent on this matter, then God will raise up someone else to preserve his nation. Because he made us a promise. We're not going to be wiped out. We still have to bring the Messiah into this world. But the only thing you'll gain from this is losing your life. However, if you do this, understand God set you up in that palace for a reason. And you have the opportunity to literally save the lives of his chosen people. You can be used by him to do something amazing here. So what does Esther do? She asks for prayer. And lots of it. She knows that God isn't just going to zap her with courage, but she knows that without God, she has no confidence or courage. So she's saying, Mordecai, pray with me. She has her servant. She's sharing with them about the true and living God. She says, let's pray to the God who can just call us to save the lives of me and my people. And so they're all praying with each other. And finally, she gets up and she's willing. But remember, she's human. She's willing to go before the king. And she's risking her life. She goes into the king's court. He raises his scepter. Her life spared. And with this opportunity, she says, I'd like to host a dinner for you. Not just telling him outright. She says, can I put a big feast for you? I'll use my allowance. I'll buy you guys all the food and wine you want. The king's like, oh, that'd be great. Thanks, sweetie. So she goes back to her room. She's like, I didn't do it. So she has the feast for him, and then she's like, so what's all this for? You looked like you had something you wanted to tell me. I just wanted to ask if you wanted to have another dinner. So you can tell she's committing to this, but not committed quite yet. So finally, after a few tries, she finally gets it out. Haman's invited too. All the members of the king's court, right? That includes him. And the king's like, look, I know you, sweetie. What's going on here? And Esther says, well, it's about my people. I'm Jewish. I never told you this, but I'm related to the people that were taken into captivity by Babylon before you. And while we've been model citizens and only asked for the right to worship our God at the expense of all the others, someone in your court has called for the death of me and my people. And the king's especially hearing that first part, and he's like, who'd want to kill you? It's Haman. Haman made you pass a law that would see me, my family, and everyone I'm related to murdered because of his fragile ego. And so the king looks at Haman and he says, you built that gallows for those insurrectionists, right? Yeah, the last time I heard about a Jewish uprising was never. You're going to hang on that gallows for everyone to see, just like you wanted. Haman, he gets executed, but understand the law still is written. And that's what kept the kings of Persia in line, is if they wrote a law and they passed it, they had to keep it too. They couldn't undo it. And that's what differentiated the Persian kingdom from the Babylonian kingdom. We'll go more into this when we get to the book of Daniel. But understand, the king was still under the authority of the law. Even when he passed it, he couldn't say, well, take backs, right? So Haman is dead, but the law is still passed, and the only ones who want to murder all of the Jewish people are surprisingly all relatives of Haman. So basically the king's thinking about this. He's like, how can I save your life? I've already passed the law. I mean, I'm sorry he tricked me, but what are we going to do? And Esther's like, I don't know. What are we going to do? And the king thinks about it, and he's like, the law says that there's a government reward along with whatever they own, they can keep, if you kill a Jewish family, right? Well, the law doesn't say that I can't pass another law that will give you all the best weapons, provision, and protection that my empire has to offer. So he signs another law that gives the Jews basically more weapons than they know what to do with. So when the Amalekites come in, with their, fancy little heirloom swords and knives, and they're like, yeah, we're going to murder a family, and they come in and there's like 50 shotgun barrels like mounted on a quad mortar and all that kind of stuff at their door. Granted, that wasn't the case, but I'm just like making that picture for you. It's like, oh, boom, right? So literally the only people who attacked the Jews on the International Kill the Jews Day were the descendants of Haman, the Amalekites. And it was here that the Amalekites were finally wiped off the face of the earth. Likewise, it was also here that the promise God made to the Jewish people that they would not pass away until all was fulfilled was also kept. But among all these things as well, there's a festival that's celebrated even to this day, known as the Festival of Purim. And Purim, pur, is the Persian word for lot, and im is the Hebrew term for plural. So it would be basically the Persian and the Jewish day of really, really good luck. Things came through for us. And it's actually almost a kind of Halloween for them. They bake these special cookies shaped like ears, and they call them Haman's ears, kind of twisted, but I'm a guy, so I find this stuff funny. And the funny thing is the girls, they dress up like Esther and like their little royal queen outfits and stuff, and the guys all dress up like Haman and they look like all these bad guys and all that stuff, and the girls chase around the boys, and it's just a lot of fun. But among all of these things, I think the most important thing to take away from the book of Esther is remembering that God always keeps his promises, and we just saw 3 kept. 1, the Jewish people would not be destroyed. God loved them and made them a promise, and he kept it. 2nd, the Amalekites would be destroyed. God made that promise to them. Why? Because God gave them mercy, and they rejected it. So what was left? Judgment. They rejected that mercy, and God kept his promise. If you don't want forgiveness, if you don't want to be a part of my kingdom, then what more can I do for you? And lastly, and I think most obviously, God always keeps his promises. And noting the one that's most significant to you and me. As Christians, he said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. To the non-Christian, he says, whoever calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. Those are 2 that I'd keep very close to heart, because if he kept his promise to the Jewish people, he'll keep his promises to us. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who's familiar with the story of Esther, perhaps not directly observed from the biblical account itself, please share the study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time in listening to the study, and once again remember, God always keeps his promises, not only for those who believe in him, but for those who wonder, have I gone too far? He made a promise, if you believe in the name of Jesus, that he not only was who he said he was and did what he showed in history for you, and that through him you have forgiveness before the throne of God. That's the only promise you only really need to know that he will keep, that if you trust in him, you will be saved. And that is a promise worth keeping, especially one worth receiving.